Hello, and welcome to another episode of Getting the Answers.
It's another great episode of Getting the Answers.
Indeed. So today's episode is about the cause of the American Civil War. Now, before we get into it, I would like to say for people tuning in that next week the time of our episode will change. Now, of course, that's always a little bit flexible because sometimes things come up and we have to do it at a different time. But the regular time, beginning next week, will be on Wednesday instead of Thursday at, of course, same time of the day, 11 Eastern, 10 Central.
Yes. Have to thank the college schedule for that change, but like we said, we'll try to keep it as consistent as possible, just make things easier for everybody.
Indeed. So before we get into the topic, do you have anything in particular that you would like to say before we start?
Not particular, no. I think we could just get into the topic. I don't have any extra things, no.
All right. So I will say that for anyone who doesn't know, the American Civil War was a war fought in the territory of the United States in the 1860s. It was between northern states and southern states. The North won, and since the war and during the war, there have been a number of different debates as to what exactly caused the war, why it happened, why people were fighting, and also afterwards there have been a lot of questions concerning historical revisionism among certain groups that may have like to view the war in a different way than would normally be the perspective that people would view it.
For sure, you this kind of gets a little bit into the topic, but I think it's still something that could be stated before we get into the actual topic. But like here in the South, Texas, Mississippi, these areas down, there's been cases where public schools have taught a different history of the Civil War than schools up in northern states did, and you can see that in modern examples too, just a little bit with the reasons they say for it, and we're going to get into some of those. But it's kind of interesting that even that happens in a little bit even now over the debate of the civil of what caused it and whatnot.
Indeed. And of course, I will say that the issues as to what caused it aren't something that there's exactly two or three different positions on. There's actually, I'd say, more a spectrum of positions where people can hold different elements of certain positions as well. But anyway, to get into the issue here, the historical events are that after the election of President Abraham Lincoln, a number of states in the South seceded and, or at least made a motion to secede from the Union, that is, the United States of America, and those states eventually got together and formed the Confederate States of America. And at this point, Abraham Lincoln opted to not remove the garrisons from a number of federally operated forts along the coast of the South, and eventually the South in South Carolina decided to attack one of these forts, which then led Abraham Lincoln to call together for an army to be formed in order to protect the federal property and to put down what at this point was now being referred to as a rebellion. And this led a number of other states to secede. And then both sides put together armies and went to war for a number of years until eventually the war ended and the Reconstruction era began where the states that had seceded had, for a time, been reduced in their rights and were slowly then reintegrated into the United States.
Right. Uh, very quick history. Yeah, but one of the major. Okay, let's put it this way. When talking about this topic, we know that slavery is going to go up. Anybody that thinks of the Civil War, that's the first thing that most likely comes to their mind. Um, when researching the topic more, okay, put it this way. The average person, when they think of the Civil War, thinks of slavery as being the root cause of it, and that's what the war happened because of that. Period. No other topics relating to it. But that's not necessarily the case. But the reason I bring that up at the start is I think that it's still largely true in the factor of why they went to war, and we're going to get into some of those details for sure. But I don't think it's as simple as just that one thing. I think there are several other issues on top of it, and you can argue the rank of those issues. But I think that there's more than just that.
Yeah, and I think that that puts up the two extreme positions that people can have on this issue. One position that is extreme is that slavery is the only reason why anything happened here, that everything can be reduced to the issue of slavery. The other extreme position is that slavery is a complete non-issue or something that's only tangential to what was going on, and that other issues were just significantly more important than slavery. I think the mainstream position is that there are multiple issues, but slavery is the bigger one among these.
Right, right. I think that yeah, that is definitely the mainstream version of the Civil War for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would put forward that a lot of people on the side that tries to say that slavery is irrelevant have a lot of problems proving this point, for the simple reason that slavery was indeed very relevant in this situation. And I can show some of the reasons that some of the states put forward as to why they had seceded. So let me just pull this up here. The multiple states had put forward a declaration of causes for their secession. So I'm going to put this up on the screen now, and there you have it. I'm just going to search out whether slavery was important or not in these instances. So what we see here is the state of Georgia, and more than 5 states seceded, but these were 5 states that actually put forward documents explaining why they seceded. Georgia says, the people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their confederates and the world the causes which have led to this separation. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. They have endeavored to weaken our security, to disturb our domestic peace and tranquility, and persistently refuse to comply with their express constitutional obligations to us in reference to that property, referring to the African slaves, and by the use of their power in the federal government have striven to deprive us of an equal enjoyment of the common territories of the republic. And this is referring to the territories, the vast territories that the United States had at this time in the West. And a major issue that was occurring at this time that caused a huge division in the United States was the admission of new states to the Union. And this, and how is this related to slavery? Well, as the United States grew, there were two different economic perspectives that emerged early on. You could describe them as the Hamiltonian perspective, which was based on a more urban class, and the Jeffersonian perspective, which was more rural. The Hamiltonians, who were the Federalists, had wanted to promote industrialization in order to make the United States a more competitive country internationally. And to do this, they held a number of protectionist ideas economically in order to ensure that American industrialization would not be stifled by British goods. Whereas the Jeffersonian perspective was more open to free trade. Now, some people like to reduce this whole economic issue to the North being industrial and the South agricultural. That's not true, because this is the mid 1800s, so both sides were very agricultural. It's just that the North had more industry than the South on this idea. Now, going into how this branched out then to the question of how states would deal with this in the expansion of the United States. As time passed, these economic perspectives became more regionalized, because although slavery was originally present throughout the entire United States, eventually it was mostly abolished in the northern parts of the country, and as the Civil War broke out, the only slaveholding parts of the North were areas that directly bordered the South, and would have been perhaps considered the South before the Civil War broke out, in a sense. So it seems to be very regional, perhaps climate-based, and we'll see that in one of the other letters of secession that they bring the climate up. But as the United States expanded, the competing economic interests meant that states being admitted to the Union, because they had an automatic representation in the Senate based on them being states of 2 senators per state. And of course, there's also the population House of Representatives, but that wasn't as big of a deal in this. As the United States expanded, if more states that were free, that is, free soil states, states where slavery was not present, were made, it would mean that they might gain an advantage in votes over the southern states. And likewise, as the southern states expanded, more slaveholding states, they could gain an advantage over the northern states. Now, as we note in Georgia's letter here, it describes the states in terms of slaveholding. And I think that this is important because it emphasizes the principal cultural marker, political marker, and economic marker that distinguished the two sides. Now, this isn't the only distinction. I think that because I've listened to different arguments from all different sides when researching this, I think that the Lost Causers have a point when they talk about there being a distinct Southern culture. I think that that's true. However, I do think that what would determine whether a new state would adopt a Northern culture or a Southern culture would be whether slavery was allowed in that new state, because that would then determine the types of people who would move there, the types of people who would invest in the state, the commerce network that the state would be a part of, the types of viable business models in the state. And as such, slavery, its presence or absence, would indeed determine the culture of the state in that sense. And in that way, slavery is not the only element of distinction, but it is an important cultural marker, I could say, that brings together the other points of distinction.
Right. When you say cultural marker, I've seen arguments suggesting that a lot of the southern states, I think Georgia especially, but I don't want to misclaim a state, but just in general, a lot of the southern states tended to be very religious. And I remember in one video, the guy used Baptist as an example, and that there were northern and southern, and I think there was another example he used. But to make this example short, he said that one of the branches of the religion was viewing themselves as almost like leaders of the slaves. Like that was their duty to have, to have slaves from a religious perspective, our religious point of view. Do you think that that led to some of it as well? Or do you think it was more just economic
Well,
interest?
I think it's very interesting because this gets into the question of why people had slaves in the first place and how they viewed their relationship with slaves, culturally speaking. Because it is true that at the time of the Civil War and leading up to it, slavery did become an important point of religious debate, and this led to the splitting of a national, a sort of nationwide network of Baptist churches into two, where the part that's seceded from that is the Southern Baptists. Now, they don't support slavery anymore today, and they don't have a racialized view nowadays. So I don't think it's fair to hold them against that today because it's been several generations and they have different views now than they did then. But that was one of the big reasons why they had split. So it was an important religious issue to people at the time. But I would also say that I think the this idea of racial paternalism in regards to slavery, or this idea that it was the duty of people to keep these people enslaved for religious purposes, I think that that is really a theological post hoc rationalization. And the reason I say this is because in the Middle Ages, the issue of slavery wasn't a question of race, it was a question of religion. So the question in the Middle Ages in regards to whether it was right to have someone enslaved wasn't a question of, is this person of another race? It was a question of, is this person of another religion? So in the Middle Ages, it was generally stated that if somebody was a slave and was converted to Christianity, that this person would have to be let free. So we see this in the Council of Nablus, because in the Middle East, the Crusaders went in and there was slavery present, and some of them had slaves, and some of the slaves converted. So the bishops had said that they should let the slaves free. And generally speaking, throughout medieval Europe, slavery was abolished in most areas. Now, that being said, as therefore, in the early modern times, when new colonies were being formed, people were being brought over as slaves, but the justification that people were using was that these people weren't Christians, and therefore it wasn't against the rules that had been explicitly set out by various councils and the popes at the time. Because early on, the early colonizers were from largely Roman Catholic countries, Portugal and Spain, but then later on we see England colonizing as well. But it was generally believed that only non-Christians could be enslaved, and that was a controversial point because there were people that were in favor of the abolition of that as well. But as slavery spread, and as slaves became culturally entrenched in the New World, many slaves began becoming Christians, And so a different reason was necessary to keep these people enslaved. And so then the main debate moved away from a question of religion to a question of race, because religion in the Enlightenment became less emphasized, so people started looking at different things. People started looking at race, and genetics hadn't really been discovered yet, but people were already thinking in terms of this and really laying the roots of later ideas of social Darwinism, for example. And so race in the 1700s became a more prominent issue for the enslavement. Now, throughout all this, the material reason why people were being enslaved was because it was profitable at the time. And so in that sense, I think, in my opinion, the theological position in regards to slavery held by pro-slavery people at the time, in my view, is a post hoc rationalization of their economic practices. So I think that they began enslaving people, and their rationalization for why it was okay for enslaving people ceased to make sense, so they needed something else to rationalize why they were enslaving these people, because through the longer traditions and through various viewpoints previously existing, it was illegitimate in previous generations. So they needed new reasons to do it. But I think that is an often overlooked angle, that a lot of people don't realize that slavery in the West, the transatlantic slave trade, originally didn't really have as much to do with race as it did with religion.
Right. Get oftentimes gets oversimplified as well. Uh, yeah, that's pretty. Yeah,
Yeah.
which has its pluses, but definitely has its negatives. Because I think learning history is important, even if it's history you don't necessarily want to learn. But that's not so much what we're doing with this particular perspective. But anyway,
Yeah. So as I understand it, going back onto the free state slave states, eventually, as compromises continued to be made, and the religious opponents of slavery became more prominent as well, and you see some pretty extreme people like John Brown, who was very militant and wanted to violently overthrow the institution of slavery. As that became more prominent in the North, people in the South were afraid that some of these people in the North would actually do that they would take away their property, that they would abolish slavery, etc. And so keeping the balance continued to be more important. But eventually, in the North, the issue of slavery became very important, to the point that it led to political splintering, where you see things like the Compromise of 1850 and the later on the Kansas-Nebraska Act led to the splintering of the Whig Party and the emergence of new political parties in order to deal with this issue. So you have the Republican Party, which had a strong free soil position with radical Republican abolitionists. So when Abraham Lincoln of the Republican Party became president, the South knew that they could expect a free soil position, especially knowing that they had essentially lost in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because Kansas was going to be admitted as a free state. So the balance was now being put off by Kansas being admitted. And of course, the fear of the balance being put off is what led to a bunch of violence in Kansas before the war. But now also a free soiler is being elected. So this free soiler while not being able to abolish slavery in the South because that would require a constitutional amendment, and the North didn't have enough states at the time to push that through. This free soiler could perhaps, however, gain new states from the Western territories and ensure that the South would and its interests would continue to be sidelined in Congress. And so I think that the South, in order to avoid running into such a situation where their interests slowly fall apart in favor of the free soil northern interests, which could eventually lead to full abolition, they decided to secede before the North could gain such an advantage. Now, of course, the North already had some advantages at this point, economically speaking, and this did mean that the South would have a hard time winning, and ultimately they didn't win. Although, theoretically speaking, if some decisive battles could have gone in a different way, they may have actually had a chance to gain independence. But that didn't. That was the unlikely option. That the unlikely outcome, even though it did come close at a couple points. Now, so therefore, the reason why the states were seceding was because they opposed the free soil idea, which was also backed by the abolitionists, which would eventually lead to their interests, their economic interests, and that includes tariffs, but largely associated with slavery, would eventually collapse. And so the states in the Deep South seceded first, and then, as I said, the Abraham Lincoln decided to keep the forts on the coast of the South, and so South Carolina sent troops in order to take Fort Sumter, which led to a bit of fighting, and then the North said, Abraham Lincoln said, we didn't shoot the first shot, but now it is time for us to fight, time to put down the rebellion. And so they raised an army, and this response upset other slaveholding states, such as Virginia, which then also decided to join in the secession. So I think something that some people overlook is that the secession happened in two waves. So the first wave in response to the Lincoln election, and then the second wave in response to the raising of an army by the North. But yeah.
No, go on.
Go on. You were saying something?
Yes, I was just gonna say I have this graphic up on a site called battlefields.org. And I'll summarize it for everybody, and I can post it in the links after for anyone interested. But long story short, they summarize their beliefs of of percentages of what made them, succeed or go into the war, so to speak. And their context, when they say context, they refer to language that they don't exactly know where to fit it. So for Georgia, it was 56% being related to slavery, and 23% they're unsure, and 15% economics, and 2% was the Lincoln election. In Mississippi, it was 73% slavery and 4% the Lincoln election. In Texas, it was 54% slavery and 4% the Lincoln election. And in South Carolina, they say 20% and 2%. So that's just general numbers off of this website's studies of the issue, which you could argue of how they got to those numbers, but I thought that would be interesting to state.
Yeah, and of course, Abraham Lincoln was a free soiler. That is, he wanted new states to only be free states, and therefore it is linked with the balance of slave states in that sense. But I'll go on to the other states and what they were saying. So Mississippi here, we're looking at Mississippi. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of a union whose principles have been subverted to work out our ruin. That we do not overstate the dangers to our institution of reference to a few facts will sufficiently prove. And so they give a list of information here, and they talk about the territories that were acquired in the West, and then it talks about other grievances here. It has grown until it denies the right of property in slaves and refuses protection to that right on the high seas, in the territories, and wherever the government of the United States had jurisdiction. It refuses the admission of new slave states into the Union and seeks to extinguish it by confining it within its present limits, denying the power of expansion. And then it talks about the nullification of the fugitive slave law, and a few other issues related to slavery, and then some issues not directly related to slavery. But nevertheless, the declaration here of Mississippi, I would say, is strongly linked with slavery. And on the point that they talk about in regards to tropical and subtropical climates here, some people say that this is very racist, but I think that a good way to understand this is if somebody spends all their life living in a tropical or subtropical climate and exposed to the diseases that are present in such a climate versus someone who lives in a temperate climate, which of the two is more likely to be able to successfully work and survive in a subtropical climate? The answer is pretty simple. It's the person that is accustomed to those conditions. So even without having to bring up issues of genetics, I think it is important to understand why slavery remained in the South and remained viable economically in the South compared to the North. It is because of those reasons which have been brought up by other people. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily genetic. What I am saying is that even without getting into genetics, somebody who lives in such a climate already is more likely to be able to work in such a climate than someone who does not. I think that that's a pretty common sense opinion there. Now, of course, the Mississippi here does indeed go into the genetic side of things, although this is before genetics is fully developed as a science. But I do think that in regards to this, it is fair to say that people with melanin can indeed react differently than people with less melanin. So based on that, I do think that they have a point. Now, some people like to criticize that point. Now, I'm not justifying slavery. Let me be very clear here. I'm not justifying the chattel slavery. What I am saying is that internally to the argument, if you consider slavery to be something that's okay, it would make sense from that position to make this argument.
Right. Even if it is just a belief in general, you can see many things being based off of beliefs, and not necessarily a full blown scientific thing.
Yeah,
But yeah,
because a lot of waves of European immigration to the South had pretty high casualty rates compared to the North. And we can see that the areas where slavery was retained after the early abolitions that the United States had in the late 1700s, early 1800s, are the areas with the more subtropical climate and bounding on that. So I think they have a point in regards to this idea. So I don't think that they are being. I don't think that they are necessarily being particularly racist when they say this. Although I'm sure that they are racist in other ways, such as their justification as to who may or may not be enslaved. Yeah. Let me go on to South Carolina. Now, interestingly, South Carolina actually doesn't talk as much about slavery as the other states. Now, South Carolina previously had the nullification crisis where it came into conflict over tariffs. So South Carolina was already a little bit had a rebellious streak and therefore was the first state that seceded. But what we see here is, but in deference to the opinions and wishes of the other slaveholding states, she forbore at the time to exercise this right. Since that time, these encroachments have continued to increase, and further forbearance ceases to be a virtue. And so in the first paragraph, South Carolina defines itself in the context of being a slaveholding state, as opposed to any other economic context or cultural context that or political context that could be put forward. The defining context it places itself in is the context of a slaveholding state among other slaveholding states. And I think that this is an important point to make when we're talking about whether or not this was considered an issue related to slavery. Because South Carolina is, like the other states here, is defining itself through its usage of slaves. Now, we know that that's not the only difference that it had with the northern states, but we know that it is what it is defining itself as. And I think that that's pretty important.
right. Uh, so I think it would be fair to say that, just to make sure I understand exactly, it would be fair to say that they still see slavery as, I'm just gonna say the word issue here, but they don't necessarily say it as much as, say, Mississippi, that's trying to make it like almost very clear that that's their motive. They're more saying like, yes, this is our motive, or one of our motives, just to say, but we want to focus over here. It
Well,
is part of it,
well, the
but
thing is, they actually bring
part.
it up later, and
Okay.
it is very apparent that it is very important. So I will read this later part as well.
Okay.
The general government, referring to the federal government here, as the common agent, passed laws to carry into effect these stipulations of the states. For many years, these laws were executed, and this is referring to laws relating to fugitive slaves and the protection of slaves as property, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and other things from the founding fathers. But an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. The states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa, all of which are non-slaveholding states, have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. And I haven't looked into specifically all of these states as to whether this is true. But if it is true, then I think it is a legitimate criticism. In many of these states, the fugitive is discharged from service where labor claimed, and in none of them has the state government complied with with a stipulation made in the Constitution. The state of New Jersey, at an early day, passed a law in conformity with her constitutional obligation, but the current of anti-slavery feelings has led her more recently to enact laws which render inoperative the remedies provided by her own law and by the laws of Congress. And it talks more about slavery. So, while South Carolina talks very much about the constitutional obligations of the federal government and of the states to each other, it emphasizes that a principal violation of these constitutional obligations is the hostility of the federal government and of the northern states to the institution of slavery. So, Texas also mentions slavery as well. Texas abandoned her separate national existence and consented to become one of the Confederated Union to promote her welfare, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure more substantially the blessings of peace and liberty to her people. She was received into the Confederacy, referring to the United States of America here, with her own constitution under the guarantee of the federal constitution and compact of annexation, which she should enjoy these blessings. That she was received as a Commonwealth holding, maintaining and protecting the institution of Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that has existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Her institutions and geographical position established the strongest ties between her and other slaveholding states of the Confederacy. And again, the Confederacy, or specifically the states with which Texas is allying itself, are defined by their status as being slaveholding. Those ties have been strengthened by association, but what has been the course of the government of the United States and of the people and authorities of the non-slave holding states since our connection with them? And slavery is mentioned several times furthermore. Virginia as well defines itself, and here in this sentence, having perverted said powers not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but to the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. So Virginia considers the United States of America to be oppressing the southern slaveholding states. So the defining characteristic that Virginia and that the other states here are expressing is that of their slaveholding. Now, once again, I will say that doesn't mean it's the only element here. Let me be very clear. We don't want to fall into a hyper-reductionist Whig historiography of this, but it is nevertheless a very big issue, an issue that was a cultural marker of these southern states and something by which they define themselves.
Sure. And you could argue that that was the state's argument for going to war. Do you think the soldiers who were fighting in the war would believe the same thing? Because I've heard this argument too, basically saying that many of the soldiers were simply just fighting for their families or fighting for the ability to live necessarily, and didn't really see slavery as one of the issues or the issue or whatever they're fighting for.
Yeah, well, the thing about the soldiers is that one thing that's very important to understand is that the reason for a war is determined by the leaders of the country. So the issue of what were the soldiers fighting for is a bit different, but it also is a bit more diverse because people have a number of different reasons for why they would want to join the military. Now, that being said, we have several letters, several hundred letters from both sides describing where soldiers write to their homes talking about the war. And what we know is that in the South, a lot of it revolved around the idea of protecting their homeland. And that was the letters that a lot of the soldiers wrote. So a lot of the soldiers weren't writing home to their families saying, I'm so happy that we have slavery in our country. Slavery is the best thing ever. Long live slavery. People weren't writing that. I think it's a bit silly for someone to expect someone to write that kind of stuff. But people were thinking of it in context of their homeland, of their property, which would include slaves. So now, that being said, that doesn't mean that all of them had slaves, because there were people who owned slaves, people who rented slaves, and then people who didn't own or were able to rent slaves. So you can divide it in that way. And of course, as it happens, a lot of rank and file soldiers would likely be poorer people in society that didn't have other things to do, such as managing a vast estate. Now, that being said, the officers were more likely to be higher class people. But similarly, what we see in the North is that in the North, some people long had this idea that people in the North were simply going in with an adventurous spirit. They just wanted to get in and kick their butts or something like that. But what we see in the North is when people are writing the letters, they sincerely care about preserving the Union, which is very interesting. Now, slavery as an issue, because we talked largely about one side of the war here, and that is the South and its reasons for secession, and of course the issue of secession and going to war are two different issues, and I think that that's something that needs to be understood, that secession is very strongly linked to slavery, and the ensuing war is linked to secession, therefore the war is linked to the secession, but from a realist geopolitical analysis, the reason why they were fighting was to preserve and to assert and to confirm the new sovereignty that they had after secession. So it was a war of independence in that sense, and that is why they fought. Now, the reason why they went independent, of course, can be linked back to slavery, as an important cultural distinction, as something that was very economically important to them. And however, I think a lot of people, when they make this chain of arguments as to, well, why did they want state rights, or why did they want to have their sovereignty, they say, well, obviously the reason behind that is slavery. But then if you're going to make that argument, you also have to logically make the next step in that argument, because slavery isn't an end in and of itself. People didn't have slaves for the simple purpose of having slaves. I think that would be an absurd perspective to take. Now, why did people have slaves? Well, because they were making money. And what did they use that money for? To either expand their business, or to make a living, to perhaps gain luxuries for more wealthier people where that was available. But generally, the pursuit of their happiness. Why did people have slaves? Because it gave them money. Why did people want money? Because it contributed to their happiness. So, in other words, the South fought the Civil War because to gain a happiness of sorts, and of course that people will say, well, that's you're digging too deep, you're being too foundational philosophically speaking. But I think this, in my view, shows this idea that trying to gain happiness can lead you into situations where you do things that very many people would consider morally wrong. So simply pursuing happiness for happiness' sake isn't something that will necessarily get you into the right direction. And I think that that's something, an interesting philosophical insight. But nevertheless, slavery should not be de emphasized for this reason as something that was important because it was mentioned. Now, some people like to say that the South was actually undermining states' rights in their position to slavery, or that slavery was a component of states' rights. But when you actually read the Confederate Constitution, what you read is that slavery is considered part of individual property rights, according to them. So it's a more individualist perspective on property rights there. But anyway, do you have any other comments on the South before we move on to talking about the North a bit more?
I don't have anything really much more to add to the South reasons. I think we covered that all pretty well. Uh, you could always argue that their economic interests led back to slavery. So, but I think just saying the one thing is a little bit too simplified, and I think we went over it as well. So,
Yeah, and I think the the simplification probably comes out from a few different positions. For example, a Marxist position would see this simplification positively because it leads into the idea of a class struggle. Also, a sort of Whig liberal position might look at this simply because you see the lionization of Abraham Lincoln as a liberator and this idea of progress towards freedom of all peoples as something that's very important. But I think something to understand about the North in the Civil War is that the North didn't set out from the beginning to free the slaves. Now, that doesn't mean that the North didn't have an interest in freeing the slaves. Especially a lot of the leadership, for example, Abraham Lincoln would have liked to free the slaves, but it wasn't viewed as a practical political perspective to hold at the time. And and just like this, the South's immediate concerns weren't about abolitionists coming into power in the North. They were about free soilers gaining into power in the North. And Abraham Lincoln was a free soiler. He wanted to stop the expansion of slavery, and this was a threatening position to the South. Now, when the war began, Abraham Lincoln, well, not when the war began, when the secession began, Abraham Lincoln didn't want to make the first move because he had this idea that he needed a moral high ground to fight the war on. Especially when you later consider that other countries had an interest in perhaps interfering in the war at various points, although that never really came to fruition. But Abraham Lincoln knew that if he was going to fight a war against the South, he would have to be able to take the moral high ground in some way in order to generate support for the war. And so Abraham Lincoln chose not to remove the garrisons from federal forts in the South. Now, the question then becomes, was the secession legitimate, and was it therefore legitimate for Lincoln to not remove the garrisons for those forts if those forts, under the idea of a successful secession, would have been technically sovereign territory and therefore no longer federal territory. But I think the U.S. Constitution actually addresses the issue of secession in some ways that a lot of people don't really think of. And I think it is sad that a lot of people especially in libertarian circles nowadays, tend to miss certain parts of a U.S. Constitution that necessarily would provide obstacles to secession. And I think a major segment of this is Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. But I'll read Section 3 of Article 4. New states may be admitted by the Congress into this union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the by the junction of two or more states or parts of states without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress. So the addition of new states necessarily required the consent of Congress. So if a state were to leave the Union and we were to reverse the process, Congress would also have to be involved in this. But people say, well, it's not specific on that. And this is where Clause 2 is very important, because I think Clause 2 is very on top of the issue here that needs to be addressed on the question of secession. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And of course, Abraham Lincoln was using this to justify retaining troops on federal property. Now, that being said, I think based on this and the fact that this is MACTA on Congress, the president doesn't actually have the authority to therefore abandon federal property in that sense. So you could argue that it was Abraham Lincoln's duty to do that. But then the question is, well, were these federal property because the states did secede? But here comes the big part. And nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. Now, it is worth noting that under the Constitution, the jurisdiction of the particular states are overlapping with that of the United States, which means if a particular state were to unilaterally secede and then claim that the territory no longer was part of the United States, it would therefore prejudice the claims of the United States to do so. And in prejudicing the claims of the United States would be criminal and therefore an illegitimate action under the U.S. Constitution. So therefore, secession in the U.S. Constitution is only legally practicable through the consent of the U.S. Congress. And because the U.S. Congress did not consent to the secession of the states in the South, according to the U.S. Constitution, that secession would necessarily have prejudiced the territory of the United States and therefore have been illegitimate. So what I'm saying is the U.S. Constitution actually forbids unilateral secession. Not in as few words, but practically speaking, unilateral secession would not be possible without violating the U.S. Constitution. Now, that being said, if an agreement had been made, then it would have been possible. Now, on the question of Abraham Lincoln, in relation to this, Abraham Lincoln is noted for having said that if he could preserve the Union and eliminate slavery, he would do it. And if he could preserve the Union without eliminating slavery, he would also do it. And I'm paraphrasing here. But the point is that preserving the Union was the primary goal of Abraham Lincoln as he set out in the war. Now, the abolition of slavery was probably something that was in his mind because he was a free soil person, and he had therefore that type of advocacy, but it wasn't part of his political platform to abolish slavery. But I think, therefore, it is excessive of some historians to say that because later on in the war, the abolition of slavery became a more important issue, that somehow overrides the fact that early on in the war, it wasn't the primary issue to the North.
Right. I've heard that argument before about Lincoln on his motivations as far as the northern states goes, and like you say, to preserve the union. I've heard from I think this was like History Channel back when they were good, but the whole argument was that he used the language of preserving the Union and had undertones of abolishing slavery. So he was kind of saying two things at the same time, uh, and using language that he thought would communicate to the northern states well, but maybe not anger the southern states too much. Type of thing is kind of what I remember from their argument before.
Yeah, and the preservation of the Union was something that was very important in this time period because the secession was in some ways already anticipated before the election of Abraham Lincoln. And we see this in the emergence of a few different political parties. As we had talked about previously in our video on political parties in the United States, what we see is the Union Party, the Unconditional Union Party, and also the Constitutional Union Party, which attempted to create an inconclusive election in order to force the states to cooperate through a congressional vote on who should be the president. But then after Lincoln was elected, the Republicans, together with the Union Party and Unconditional Union Party, and some Northern Democrats and whatever remained of the Whigs, put together a new coalition called the National Union Party. So in that sense, the Union, in how the North referred to itself and how they characterized themselves, was always very important at that time period. Now, that being said, the opposition to slavery was also important in most of the North, but of course, it wasn't practical for a number of different reasons. And that is because some slave states actually hadn't seceded. So if Abraham Lincoln had, for example, let's say if he had immediately favored the abolition of slavery, the slave states that hadn't seceded at that point may have seceded, or they may have offered some sort of resistance to this. Now, another thing to demonstrate the question of whether it was about whether the North fought over the issue of slavery is the question: would the North have still contested the secession if slavery was a non-issue? That is to say, if in a hypothetical world where either everybody had slaves or nobody had slaves, and the secession still happened for whatever reason, would the North have still contested the secession? Other things being equal as they are in our regular timeline, I would say they still would have. And under that idea, the issue of slavery wasn't the North's primary motivation for why they were going to war with the South.
That is definitely a interesting argument or interesting topic to think about. I don't think argument's the right word, but interesting topic to think about. And I think I would tend to say that they would as well. But I think I'm not sure if it would have lasted as long or if as many deaths would have happened from it, because I do think that slavery gave the extra motivation behind it. So I'm not sure if that would have been there in the hypothetical example, but maybe something else could have replaced it. But
Yeah.
we don't.
And then another question then becomes, would the South have seceded if slavery was a non-issue? And I think that's a bit more complicated question because we do see the nullifiers in South Carolina putting up some trouble in the nullification crisis. So theoretically speaking, it could be possible, but I say that if in such a situation, if a secession had happened, it would be much smaller and would likely have been resolved more easily.
Right,
It would
because
have essentially perhaps been at the scale of the nullification crisis, or maybe slightly larger, but resolved relatively peacefully. Perhaps there might have been some conflict, but I would say that the conflict would have been much reduced. So I do think that slavery certainly was a major part in the distinction between the two macro regions of the country.
right, I think it would have gave it its extra motivation, you could say, to keep the war going. So I also, yeah, I think slavery was the big thing for the South, mainly for economic reasons. And in the hypothetical example, without slavery, I think it would. The only way it would be possible is if somehow the Union, the North, would make such harsh tariffs for factory supplies or something like that, stuff they can only get from northern factories. I think that would be the only way that could spark something. But then I think it would be more of a different type of war, really, than the war we had happened. So
Yeah, and what we know is that the big tariff that happened at around the time of the Civil War breaking out happened after the secession. And some people argue that the North was going to put a huge tax on the South in the tariffs. And of course, this is before income tax. So tariffs was one of the main ways that the U.S. government had revenue. It was one of the principal revenue sources of the U.S. government. But the big tariff that happened at around the outbreak of the Civil War happened after the secession. So I think that that's something that's worth noting there. But anyway, I would say that I think one thing surrounding this is that there's a great amount of hostility among different sides debating this issue, and some of which I think is quite unwarranted. I think that a lot of the mainstream positions, and I suppose I fall into somewhere alongside the mainstream. Although I would, because I don't say that slavery is the only reason, and I don't go to that extreme. I'm not part of the idealist perspective here. I'm part of a more realist perspective that yes, slavery is a central issue and a definitional issue and cultural marker and everything, but there's other surrounding issues that a lot of people that hold that extreme perspective on the slavery issue are extremely agitated and offended at opposing positions. And I would consider these people also to be revisionists as well, because they essentially reduce the Civil War to a single issue, which I think is a silly perspective to take on any war. But in regards to the opponents to this, there might be some that are aggressive as well. But I think that this aggression, this vitriol that occurs over this issue, is not fostering reconciliation. It's not fostering de-radicalization, and it certainly isn't fostering a healthy discourse.
right. I think our motives here as humans studying history, are at least interested in history, is trying to reach conclusions that are accurate, or at least more accurate than they were. And sometimes that means accepting things that you don't want to accept, because that's just what happened in the past.
Yeah,
But I think we're never going to reach that for if people keep arguing from two extreme perspectives.
yeah,
And I think that that needs to end in a large way.
yeah. Because I think one side is very focused on lionizing Abraham Lincoln and ignoring some of the things that he did that were less savory. For example, how he treated the press, and it could be argued that he violated several constitutional rights of people in the course of fighting the war, and that this set a bad precedent followed by some other future presidents. Nevertheless, Abraham Lincoln, because of the huge emphasis people place on slavery as an issue, is considered one of the top two presidents of the United States, alongside with George Washington, by most historians. They ever have one or the other on top, and it's usually George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Personally, I would say that his preservation of the Union is something that is very admirable, and I also like the abolition of slavery. I'm not someone who's pro the slavery that the South had, but I think that some of the other presidents are better than Abraham Lincoln on other issues, and the lionization of Lincoln in that sense, I think, is a bit excessive. Now, that being said, there's then people that want to villainize Lincoln to an absurd degree. But anyway, another perspective I've heard on this is the perspective of Andrew Napolitano. He's a he used to be a judge. I think he's frequently a pundit nowadays, and he he takes an interesting sort of libertarian perspective where he says that slavery was dying out anyway, and that the war was Lincoln's fault because he wanted to fight a war over an issue that he didn't have to fight over. That if he had just let the South go, that slavery would have died out and everybody would have been happy, and the deadliest war in American history wouldn't have had to happen. Now, I think that based on the Constitution and on realist principles of international relations, I think Abraham Lincoln had an obligation to fight the war in that sense. So now Napolitano is a libertarian, so he has a bit of a different perspective than me on certain issues in relation to this. So he's probably thinks that the secession was okay, although he's not pro-slavery. I think that that's something to say about him. But I think it's a lot of people have this idea that slavery was on the decline, and it was just going to disappear eventually. And you know what? That may have been true. But the fact is that we have slavery today still. So I think a few important things to understand about slavery and business in general is, one, people who economic actors aren't always rational. So just because a new business model is better doesn't mean that a person will necessarily accept a better business model, especially when you consider that infrastructure for the older business model is already well established. And I think it's like saying that if a new printer comes out each year that's slightly better than the previous year, you don't buy the new printer each year. You buy it every few years. You buy it when you need a new printer. And I think that a similar thing applies to the way people who had slaves treated slavery, as it was something that was useful to them at the time, and even though it might have been becoming less useful, it was still useful. And I think that that's another issue to understand is just because something isn't optimal doesn't mean that it doesn't work at all economically. For example, the Soviet Union existed for several decades, and you could criticize the economics of the Soviet Union all you want, and I think there are very many legitimate criticisms of the economics of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union still functioned for several decades, and it didn't collapse in on itself during that time. So that's another point to make. And the third point I'd like to make on this, or the fourth, depending on how you're counting, is that just because slavery is not viable in some conditions doesn't mean that it's not viable in all conditions. And to this, I offer the example that slavery still exists today in many countries, even though it's illegal. And and you could say even in the United States, there's illegal enslavement of people that occasionally is found out. And of course, uh, penal labor is legal in the United States, but that's a different issue. I'm talking about chattel's slavery. It still exists in the world today, and the fact that it still exists, even though it's been over 100 years of economic development, indicates to me that it must be in some areas still competitive, competitive enough to be successful, to be profitable for people. So in that sense, this idea that slavery is 100% obsolete, I think, is a perspective that tends to oversimplify economics. Because what we know is that there are people nowadays that make a profit from slavery, that even if it is an ineffective system, it doesn't mean that there is zero effectiveness, and it also doesn't mean that people wouldn't do it anyway. So, in that sense, I think this idea that slavery was going to completely be ineffective hasn't come to fruition. I think it's similar to the Marxist ideas about how eventually certain systems will collapse and how things will automatically move in a certain direction. I think similar Whig ideas are also not true. Now that doesn't mean that I support slavery. I do not support the chattel slavery that I'm talking about nowadays. What I'm saying is that it's not as economically simple as some people think it is.
Right. Regardless of, well, let's put it this way: the mass majority of people are anti-slavery, as they should be. But there's always going to be a few people that are tend to be power trippy people, which is usually what you see in these rare instances of when people get caught, let alone the countries that still have it. But anyway, is the idea that they see as owning the slave as a sense of power, and people are always going to seek that, and some people are going to seek it enough to have it happen. So to argue that slavery is going to be completely gone, I think is foolish to say, because we're going to see instances of it, even though we probably shouldn't. So I agree with what you're saying there. Only thing I would argue is I don't necessarily think that his argument was arguing in absolutes. I think he would, and I didn't listen to this, but I think he would probably say that there could be instances of slavery still existing, but the large mass of the southern states wouldn't have it. So there still wouldn't be war. There may be some still happening, but not enough to justify the war. I think what his counter argument to that would be, and you could argue principle on that argument too, uh, but it may have avoided the mass casualties. Hard to say.
Yeah, I just disagree with him on the virtue of fighting the war. I think it was the duty of the U.S. government to fight the war. I know that a lot of people take a different perspective on that. I know that there's a lot of people that are in favor of secession, but I'm not one of those people. But anyway, that's it for the discussion. Do you have anything to say before we end?
Only thing is, I'm doing my podcast tomorrow on my YouTube channel. So if anybody just wants to watch that, it will be tomorrow for that. Probably around the same time in the morning. And also, just want to mention again that next week will be on my channel at 10 on Wednesday, and that will be our new show time. Wednesday at 10 Central Time or 11 Eastern.
Yeah. So thank you all for watching, our beautiful audience. And tune in next week. Goodbye.